today's recipe is a delicious vegan dinner. The first thing that I'm going to be making is vegan potato gnocchi. Then we're going to move on to vegan ricotta cheese, and it honestly just tastes like normal ricotta cheese. It's so weird when you try it. And then lastly, we're going to be making tomato sauce that's like fresh and homemade and delicious. You can put it on pizza, you can put it on pasta, and for today's recipe we're going to be putting it on our potato gnocchi. So let's start making this. Starting off with the vegan potato gnocchi, around an hour ago I put 3 small red potatoes into the oven to bake at gas mark 5, and yeah, it took around 1 hour. So I'm just going to get them out and they should be really soft inside. So I allowed them to cool for around half an hour and I turned the oven off and just let them cool in there. However, I wish I took them out and then let them cool because they're still kind of hot, but it should be okay. Just make sure you don't do this recipe when you just take them out of the oven for the first time, because honestly you will burn your hands. I did that the first time and they were very hot. So the first thing that we need to do is take the skin off these potatoes. For this I'm just going to use a fork, and I absolutely love these potatoes because they're so much more creamier than your average plain looking potatoes. And yeah, I just think they taste so much better. But obviously you can use normal potatoes to do this, but yeah, I just much prefer using red potatoes. You can also use sweet potatoes if you like. Obviously your gnocchi are going to be much more sweeter than using normal potatoes, but honestly it's just up to you. Whatever you would like to use, just use it. And you can play around with the recipe as well. You can add different stuff just to see how that works. And there's still steam coming off this, so I'm going to be very careful with my fingers so I don't burn them. Make sure there is no little brown bits on your potatoes, otherwise there will be little brown bits in your gnocchi and you really don't want that. You want them to look all the same colour, and you just want them to look pale potatoey colour. I find that the longer you bake your potatoes, the easier they are to peel, because the skin is already peeling itself when it's been in the oven for a long time. So it will just make your life a little bit easier if you leave your potatoes in the oven for a long time. For the next part, you can either use a cutting board, a chopping board, or just do it on the counter like I'm doing. It doesn't really matter. Now you just need to mash up the potatoes. I recently found this quinoa flour in the shop and I just really wanted to have a go with it, and I've used it in a couple recipes and it works really well. So that's what I'm going to be using today, but obviously you can just use plain flour or gluten-free flour, which is this. But yeah, you can just choose whatever flour you would like, and I've got no real measurements for this. I just kind of keep adding it till I think there's enough, because you need kind of like a dough texture, because we need a dough to be able to cut it into pieces easily. So I'm just going to keep adding flour until I think it's the right consistency, and it should be around like 3-4 tablespoons, but depending on how big your potatoes are, obviously it's going to change. But I'm just going to start off with around half a tablespoon, and then I'm just going to mash the potato with the flour. I just find that this is kind of the easiest way. It also may be easy for you to put this in a bowl. I just realised that, but honestly I don't really mind. Once the mixture gets a little drier, you can also use your hands to mix the flour with the potato. But I personally just like using a fork. I just find it a little easier because my hands get a little less messy. I mean, I've still got potato all over, but yeah, I like using a fork. Be careful not to add too much flour, otherwise your gnocchi is going to be very dry and crumbly and won't come together nicely like gnocchi should. So just be careful how much you add. You will need a lot of flour, but not too much. I've now formed a nice ball and it doesn't stick to the surface or anything, and I'm just going to get a little bit of cling film and wrap it round and put it in the fridge for around 10 to 15 minutes. For the vegan ricotta cheese, what you're going to need is some oat milk or just a dairy-free milk of your choice. You're also going to need a little bit of ground cumin. This is personally my favourite spice. Also about 1/3 of a block of tofu, and this is firm tofu. You don't need to drain it or pat the water out or anything like that. You can just leave the tofu how it is, and also I cut it into little blocks so it's easier to blend. You're also going to need a little bit of salt. This is Himalayan salt because it just has a few minerals in it, which makes it so much better for you than normal salt. I also have some smoked paprika. You're also going to need some nutritional yeast. This is a really healthy vegan alternative to cheese flavour. It's also really good for you. It has vitamin B12, zinc, iron, biotin, and a ton of other minerals and vitamins. So you need this as well, and a little bit of ground pepper. You're also going to need some sort of blender. I personally don't have the Vitamix or a magic bullet or something like that, so I just use a handheld blender and it just works fine. It just blends the stuff up and does its job. So for this, all you need to do is place all the ingredients in a container to blend in, blend it all up, and then you're done. It's so easy. That's what I told you at the beginning, like these recipes are just so easy. So I'm just gonna start off by placing the tofu into the container, and yeah, as I said before, cutting it into little blocks really does help the blending process, especially if you haven't got a very strong blender like myself. I'm just going to like put a pinch of pepper in, kind of like a pinch to 1/2 teaspoon will do. I don't really measure out when it comes to this recipe. I just kind of do it by eye. I would say another pinch of smoked paprika, not a lot at all. Quite a lot of salt, so more than a pinch, like a large pinch, let's say. Maybe a large pinch and a half, because the salt really does bring the flavour out. Cumin, I feel like cumin just brings out a non-vegan flavour in food. That's my personal opinion, that's why it's my favourite seasoning, because adding this to anything is amazing. So I just added around 1/2 teaspoon of ground cumin. Now I'm just going to add a heaped teaspoon, or maybe like 1/2 tablespoon of nutritional yeast. Maybe I'll put a little bit more. And then lastly, the oat milk. I used to have soy milk all the time because I felt that it was the best substitute to real milk because the texture is so much creamier. However, I've recently heard loads of bad reviews of soybeans, so I'm kind of steering away from it. However, saying that, I have tofu that's made of soybeans, but I kind of just have a little bit of it and it's okay. And now I'm just going to add a splash of dairy-free milk, maybe 2 splashes. Not too much, you don't want it to be too liquidy. I think I added a little bit too much. So the mixture should look like this once you're done. Next up, just blend it and then we're done. I'm just going to use a spoon to scrape down the sides so all of the ingredients are well incorporated. Otherwise, it won't be mixed well at all. This mixture is so creamy and it's honestly exactly like ricotta cheese. So the texture should look something like this. It should kind of be a little bit sloppy but still hold some sort of shape. And I'm just going to add this to a bowl and save it for later once we finish making all the other ingredients for this recipe. The gnocchi mixture is nearly ready to come out of the fridge, and just before it does, I put some water into a flat saucepan. And it's really important that it's a flat saucepan because if it's a tall one and if it's really small, the gnocchi bits are going to stick together and it just won't look great. So this is an optional step, but you can add a pinch of salt, and this will just make sure that the gnocchi doesn't stick together once it gets put in. You then need to bring this water to a boil on the stove, so that's what I'm going to do right now. The last part of this recipe is the tomato sauce. So what you need to do is wash your blender because you're going to need that again. So that's what I'm done. I'm just drying it now. And you're going to need to grab a chopping board, just a small one will do, you're not going to chop that much. and also some salt, some pepper and some spices. A tomato, this is just one large beef tomato, and this will be enough for just a little bit of tomato sauce. You're also going to need a pinch of ground pepper, a pinch of salt, and I've got the same salt I had before, the Himalayan salt. You're going to need some dried thyme and some dried basil, and I didn't mention this before, but a knife. So all you're going to need to do is chop the tomato, place that into the blender, and then put the seasonings into that container as well, and then blend it together, and then you've got your tomato sauce. You don't need to chop the tomato into very small bits. I would say into 8 would be small enough. When it comes to the dried herbs, you're going to need half a teaspoon of each herb. So that's half a teaspoon of dried basil and half a teaspoon of dried thyme. The last thing that you need to do with the tomato sauce is just place it into a bowl, so we can use it later when we ensemble the whole dish. An optional step with this tomato sauce is that you could strain it, so you can just place it in a sieve and just push out the little bits from the sauce. If you have like a fussy kid, for example, and they don't like little bits in their sauce, but I personally don't mind with the little herby bits. I really don't mind, so I'm not going to bother with that step. It's been around 15 minutes, so it was time to take my gnocchi mixture out of the fridge. So now what I'm going to do is just to sprinkle a little bit of flour onto the chopping board and then smooth it out a little bit, and this will just ensure that the gnocchi mixture doesn't stick onto the chopping board, and it will just make my life a little bit easier. Now I'm just going to get a little bit of the gnocchi mixture and then just make a little ball with it. Not too big because we don't want massive gnocchi balls, and that's kind of the size you want them to be. Obviously you can make them any shape and any size you want them to be, but this is just my personal preference. And then you can roll them in the flour a little bit. It will make sure that they don't stick to each other. And you just carry on doing this with the rest of the dough. I just finished rolling all of the gnocchi balls and the water is boiling, so I'm going to place each one into the boiling water, and they can all boil at the same time. Once they rise to the top, so they rise to the surface, I'm just going to take them out and allow them to cool, and I'll show you the end product. The gnocchi has now finished cooking and they look like this. You need to make sure that as soon as they rise to the top of the water, you take them out as soon as that happens. Otherwise they'll get so squishy, they'll just fall apart, and you do not want that to happen. So now I'm just going to plate up. So I've got this really nice plate I recently got, so I'm just going to put it all on here. I'm just going to top off this dish with some fresh herbs, and I'm just going to place this on the top to add a little bit of a pop of colour. So this is the end product. This is my gnocchi and tomato and ricotta cheese dish. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and if you try it out, please DM me on Instagram. My Instagram is cat_Sullivan_X. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this recipe, and see you next time. Bye!